All right, welcome to the second installment of this series of lectures or talks where we're just talking around the need to know on nutrition. Nutrition is a pretty big topic. It's an important topic, and it's a topic that gets talked about a lot. The goal of this series of talks is for you to develop basically what you need to know. So if you don't go and research any further, you have the tools required to create your own diet plan, or at least to have the critical faculties or the baseline knowledge to know if someone is advocating something that's sensible or someone that's advocating something that's maybe a bit out there or something that's bullshit. There is a hell of a lot of money in this space. So the topic we're going to be talking about now, macro and micronutrients, this has been one of the biggest vectors for misinformation. So fat has been demonized and carbohydrates have been demonized a lot in the media. So you have low fat and low carbohydrate diets, multi-million pound books, multi-billion pound supplement industries designed around protein. There's a hell of a lot of interest or financial interest in this topic. And as such, there's a hell of a lot of information out there, both good and bad, and some completely erroneous. So what we're going to present today is basically the state as we understand it. So we're not going to go into massive detail. We're not going to make any kind of crazy. We're not going to make any kind of. We're not going to go off piste too much. We're just going to stick to the facts, and we're going to give you some tools and some information. So going forward, you understand where these nutrients stack up in your diet plan, and then how you could potentially manipulate them to your own whims. So there are three macronutrients, and they're called macronutrients because they make up the vast majority of the calorie intake of your diet. And you've heard of them before. We have protein, which is 4 calories per gram, carbohydrate, which is 4 calories per gram, and fat, which is 9 calories per gram. We're now going to go into a bit more detail on the three, so you have an idea of their function in the body, where you can get them in your diet, and also some considerations you might have around how much of these macronutrients you use to make up your calorie allowance. So first of all, there's protein. We'll all be aware of protein. Is loads of uses in the body, from cell repair. So that's just not just muscle tissue. That's liver, brain. Basically, your entire body is made up of protein and fat. So it's used within a lot of metabolic activity. It's burned for energy in some instances. It's used within hormonal activity. It's used within metabolic activity. It's got a hell of a lot of use in the body. And from a training standpoint, what we're really interested in is protein's use in the repair of damaged tissue. So when we weight train or train in general, or if the goal of the training is to induce some kind of physiological adaptation, then there is stress put on the body in the form of exercise and training that causes damage, and it's the recovery from that damage. That process is what makes people bigger, stronger, faster, fitter. So there are three states you can be in when it comes to protein, or what's termed as muscle protein synthesis, protein turnover. There's a bunch of anabolic, catabolic. There's a bunch of names for it, but there's typically three states you can be in. You can be in a steady state where the degradation of proteins and the synthesis of proteins is net the same. That means you stay the same. You don't get bigger. You don't get smaller. You don't get weaker. You don't get stronger. You just stay the same. Then you've got what's being termed here as pool expansion. That would also be termed as net positive protein synthesis, or being in an anabolic state. This is when either increased synthesis of muscle protein or protein in general is increased, and there's unchanged degradation. So you're not breaking down as much protein. And then the other way that could be formed is there's a decreased amount of degradation, but there's an unchanged synthesis. So you could be in the process of damaging more cells, so in a high training load per se, but you have an increased protein intake, higher than normal, and that leads to a net positive effect. or you could have decreased degradation. So you could maybe be in a taper or a lighter phase of training, or just a less stressful period in your life, but also unchanged dietary content. But that could potentially lead to being net positive, because you're not breaking down as much muscle protein or as much protein in general, or there's not as much catabolic pressure on the system. So you could end up in a net anabolic or a net positive protein synthesis state. And then the other state we have is pool contraction, which is negative protein synthesis, net negative protein synthesis, or catabolic state, which is how it could also be termed. And then pretty much the mirror opposite we've just seen. You could have an unchanged synthesis, so you could have the same protein intake, but an increased degradation. So a practical example, you could be going into a big period of training, much higher training loads, much higher volumes, but you haven't changed your diet to reflect that. And that could actually lead to you going into a more catabolic state, or into like a more stressful state. Or you could have the mirror opposite. You've got decreased intake, but your training load or your degradation has stayed the same, both of which are going to lead to a net negative or catabolic state. So protein, there are many sources of protein, and then this is a big differentiation depend on your dietary approach. So if you're omnivorous, you eat whatever, you can eat all of this stuff. If you're vegetarian, obviously there'll be certain animal products you won't want to consume, and if you're vegan, again, you won't want to consume any animal products. So this is going to be a big differentiation factor in your food choice. We're still looking to hit the same targets, regardless if we're vegan, vegetarian, or we eat whatever. We should be looking to hit, when we talk about the protein targets, that stands for everybody. There is one caveat that I want to just explore quickly. So there's something called bioavailability of protein, which you can't see because my head's in the way. But that basically means when you take in 20 grams of protein, the higher the bioavailability of that protein, the easier it is for your body to utilize that source, to utilize the amino acids within that protein for whatever metabolic activity your body wants to use it for. Typically speaking, animal products tend to have a higher bioavailability, so they tend to be a higher quality protein source. Your body can actually utilize them better and easier. And here we have from best to worst in terms of the bioavailability. So you have whey protein isolate being the best, whey concentrate being the next, whole egg, cow's milk, blah, 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 and all the way down. There is something that you can do to increase the bioavailability of any protein source, and that is to supplement the amino acid leucine with any feeding. So if you're a vegan or a vegetarian and you want to increase the bioavailability of the proteins you consume, you may want to look at supplementing with leucine during any big protein feeding or any protein feeding. It's not going to be a make or break factor. It's more than possible to get big and strong as a vegan or a vegetarian. It just means you need to think about your protein sources to ensure you have enough, and you might need to, if you want to optimize it, then supplementing with leucine is quite a good strategy. So how much protein is enough? There is actually a hell of a lot of research on this. There are some techniques which aren't very good, such as net nitrogen balance. Tends to be the most researched, although modern studies don't really use it anymore. But you get some really spurious outcomes if you follow the letter of the line for nitrogen balance. There are amino acid tracer studies and some other techniques that are much more accurate that are used in modern studies. But it's just to say that these recommendations aren't ironclad, 100%. You must do these. These are just best practice. If you're in this ballpark, you're going to capture 90% of what you need to do, just to put a number on it. Generally, it's recommended that you eat between 1.2 to 2 grams. This number fluctuates up and down. When I was at university, it was 1.4 to 2.2 grams. And depending on the governing body, you read their statement on protein intake. Again, the number will fluctuate. But generally speaking, if you're between 1.2 and 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, you really can't go wrong. You might want to be higher on that stage, depending on your goals. But as long as you're within that bracket, you're going to capture the vast majority of what you need out of your dietary protein intake. And any other suggestion outside of just the gross intake, as in the 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, these are all optimization. If you only want to take away one thing, just make sure you have enough protein in your diet, and that's 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram. So you should eat roughly about 25 to 40 grams per serving. So this comes from, again, nitrogen, or this comes from amino acid tracer studies. And they try to determine how much protein synthesis is upregulated based off the size of the feeding. So if you compare a 15-gram whey isolate feeding to a 25-gram whey isolate feeding, there is a big increase in the muscle protein synthesis when you intake 25 grams versus 15 grams. That trend is held weekly up to about 40 grams. And then after 40 grams, 50, 75, 100 grams, the effect that feeding has on the muscle protein synthesis is diminishing or negligible. So if you want to optimize what you're doing, you want to be eating about 25 to 40 grams per serving. You want to be eating that protein on regular intervals, generally speaking, every 2 to 4 hours, because we want to keep amino acids available in the bloodstream. We want to keep muscle protein synthesis elevated. So for terms of hypertrophy or recovery, again, we want to be eating protein on regular intervals. So every 2 to 4 hours is ideal. You don't have to get up in the middle of the night to have a protein shake. As a lot of bodybuilders have done, and I have done in the past. That's not required. I mean, if you want to, it's not going to hurt. But I think having a higher quality sleep probably outweighs that benefit of high quality sleep outweighs the positive of having an extra protein feeding during the night. When you're in surplus or have a higher carbohydrate content in your diet, that is muscle protein sparing. So you might get away with having a lower protein intake. Whereas if you're in a low carbohydrate diet, or you're in a calorie deficit, you want to have a higher intake of protein. So if you're in a calorie deficit, you might want to look at 2 grams, even 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, because it's going to be muscle sparing. Also, if you're in a low carbohydrate diet for whatever reason, you also will want to look at having that higher 2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram body weight. Again, there are modulating factors. There's context to these things. So what we speak around are just generalities, and then you need to kind of take those generalities and adapt them to your own circumstance. So carbohydrates, these are your body's main source of energy. So what we have here is we have a pretty simple energy pathway diagram. So basically, the shorter the duration of the exercise and the higher the intensity, the more you're going to use anaerobic systems. So the 2 anaerobic systems or 3 anaerobic systems are ATP, creatine phosphate, and anaerobic glycolysis. So this is where carbohydrate comes into the picture. So anaerobic glycolysis is going to be intermuscular. So it's going to last a minute or slightly longer. So this is like high intensity sprinting, sets of 10, sets of 15, sets of 20. Higher intensity activities such as CrossFit will utilize this energy system a hell of a lot. So carbohydrates intake is incredibly important for that kind of sport. So a sport like CrossFit or a middle distance running or an intermittent athlete like a football player or a rugby player will definitely require higher carbohydrate intakes. In the terms of lifters, carbohydrate intake is going to be incredibly important for recovering between sets and recovering between sessions. We want to have so you want to have your muscle your glycogen. To take a step back, glycogen is how your body stores carbohydrate. It'll store glycogen in the liver, and that's where a big bolus is there, but it would also store it intermuscularly. So it'll be stored in the muscle. So if you're a cyclist, say, you will have large glycogen stores within your legs because your body needs that energy close by. And it's that muscle, it's the glycogen that is stored in the muscle that gets used anaerobically. When we work out the higher durations or lower intensities, we start using the oxidative system. Now, the oxidative system will use fast oxidative glycolysis, which is going to utilize carbohydrate, and that carbohydrate is going to come from the liver into the bloodstream, and then it's going to enter into the cell, across cell membrane from the blood. And how the ATP is going to be released from that glycogen is from that glucose by that stage anyway, is going to be via oxidation. So you're gonna burn it with oxygen, and that's going to free up the ATP, and then your mitochondria is going to use that ATP to contract. All mitochondria uses ATP, and everything your body does to derive ATP, whether it's creating phosphate, fast glycolysis, slow glycolysis, or fat oxidation, it's all to free up ATP from chemical reactions. Your body, we'll cover it now because we're talking about it. Your body will oxidate fat when you're at low intensity. So when you sleep, that's when you burn the most fat. When you walk, you're going to use a mixture of fat and carbohydrate oxidation. And then when you break out into a jog, it's going to be more equal between fat and glycogen oxidation. And then as you ramp up the intensity, it becomes more anaerobic in nature. There's not really any situation outside of maybe the actual contraction of 1 rep max or 100-meter sprint where you're going to use purely one energy system. And even then, if you do a 100-meter sprint, you have oxygen debt. So when you recover from your 1 rep maxes, your 5 rep maxes, your 100-meter sprints, your 200-meter sprints, it's going to be the oxidative process that your body uses to derive energy for that recovery. There's never really any one point in space and time where you're using only one energy system. So it's a pretty flawed way of thinking. To think, right, this is anaerobic. So kind of like the alactic sort of training is a bit spurious the way they kind of break it up. There isn't any really nothing happens in the body in like a clean cut manner. Everything is analog. It's an analog system. It's not a digital system. Things aren't off or on. Things are working all the time. So that's just a little talk around the energy system, and where carbohydrate comes into that is you either have anaerobic or fast glycolysis, and then we have oxidative or slow glycolysis. Carbohydrates are pretty much all glucose or all carbohydrate polymers. There's different sizes of polymers. So you look at that little chart there, you'll see you have monomers, glucose, fructose. You have disucrolids or dimers. I'm really bad at pronouncing stuff. So sucrose, maltose, and then you have polymers, starch, and cellulose as examples. That's basically just the size of the carbohydrate molecule. So your body breaks it down a little bit slower if there's a bit more complex, or it can intake it faster if it's less complex. It's not as big a factor as people make it out to be. Like having high chronic sugar intake is a problem, but generally we're not really trying to advocate that anyway, so it's not really anything you should really be worrying about. Carbohydrate sources: fruits, grains, vegetables, dry nuts, and others. And again, depending on the source, you'll have like more complex or less complex carbohydrates. So glucosade is fairly uses glucose, which is a simple carbohydrate, or you could eat something like broccoli or eat like whole grain bread, which is going to be our oats, which are more complex and going to have a slower release into the bloodstream and cause less of an insulin spike. And that's where the complexity of a carbohydrate is important. If you're doing high intensity exercise, such as middle distance running, or you're doing like high intensity cycling, you want to have a simple carbohydrate source on hand. And generally speaking, that should be diluted in water. Something like Lucozade Sport is pretty much ideal. You might even want to dilute that even more. So 500 milliliter to 500 milliliter Lucozade Sport. If it is too high of a glucose content, it's gonna sit in your gut, and it's hard for it changes the osmolality in the gut. So a higher glucose content makes it harder for the glucose to get into the bloodstream and eventually get into the muscle cells. So you want a more diluted source. So Glucosade Sport's good, but also you might want to dilute Glucosade Sport further if you want to get it into your working muscle faster. And that's for like kind of middle distance events. So anywhere where you're working a high percentage of VO2 max for 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes. That's an important tactic. How much is enough? So carbohydrate content in the diet is really modulated by everything first. So you need to work out your calories first. You need to work out your protein needs first. You need to work out your fat requirements first, and then basically the carbohydrate will make up the remainder. We have an example at the end or towards the end where we'll kind of put this in the picture so you can kind of work out what I'm talking about. Carbohydrates generally needed in the diet for two things. It's to replenish spent glycogen. So when you do a hard training session or you do a training session, your muscle glycogen is going to be depleted. So you want carbohydrate intake to help replenish those levels. And also we discussed more in depth in the previous slide. If you're doing a high intensity, longer duration activity like endurance cycling, middle to long distance running, or a high intensity intermittent team sport like rugby or soccer, you might want to look at you want to supplement glucose in the form of a drink or a tablet, so you can keep blood glucose elevated, so you can keep up outputs at higher VO2 max intensities for longer periods of time. That's the only real scenario you're going to need that, and it's kind of debatable really in team sports. But if you're working on a high percentage of VO2 max, so like Tour de France, 10,000 meter, 20,000 meter marathon running, where you're running at a high sustained pace, you definitely need to supplement glycogen or glucose in those scenarios. As a lifter, you don't need to, but you need to have, well, you don't need to, strictly speaking, because there's glycolysis where your body will make carbohydrate with protein and fat. However, realistically, you want to have carbohydrates in your diet. There's no real reason not to. And as an athlete who doesn't take part in middle distance, longer distance, high intensity events, or you're not training 2 or 3 times a day, you want to have carbohydrates in your diet to replenish the muscle glycogen that you're utilizing. So examples, you might want to utilize carbohydrate on training days, so have a higher carbohydrate content on your training day to help replenish the carbohydrate that you've used in your training. On rest days, you might want to lower because you don't really need it. And if you're doing like double training days, like weights in the morning, conditioning in the evening, or you're splitting up a large workload into 2 different training sessions, you want to have a high carbohydrate day on that day, to try and replenish the muscle glycogen between bouts of exercise so that your performance doesn't suffer. Fat, so similar to protein, fat has a hell of a lot of actions in the body. It makes up cell membrane walls. It makes up a lot of the hormones in your body, or helps to make up a lot of hormones in your body, and it's also utilized in loads of different cellular processes and metabolic processes. So it's something you want in your diet. It's definitely not something you want to omit. If you don't have protein and don't have fat in your diet, your health will suffer. If you don't have carbohydrate in your diet, your health will probably be okay, but your performance is going to suffer day to day and in training. So that's why we want carbohydrate in the diet. Fat and protein in the diet, we want that for health. So it's not something we want to omit. Low fat diets are a terrible idea. Low carbohydrate diets are also generally a terrible idea, but low fat diets are a super terrible idea. There are 3 kinds of fat. There's 4 kinds of fat, I guess. We'll forget about trans fat just now. So there's saturated fat. So what a saturated fat is basically all of the on the fat polymer it's completely saturated with hydrogen ions, and that's what gives it its kind of stodginess. So on animal fat like beef fat, cheese, and vegetables, coconuts, condensed milk, I guess. They're all this. I don't think condensed milk's vegetable, but anyway, that's a bad example. They're basically solid at room temperature. That's the differentiating factor in a saturated fat is solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fats, you have polyunsaturated, such as vegetable oil or fish fats, and then you have monosaturated. So polysaturated means that there are some hydrogen ions on the polymer. So it could be liquid or less viscous than saturated. So chicken fat can be polyunsaturated. Pork fat, to a lesser degree, can be polyunsaturated. Fish fat is definitely polyunsaturated. Olive oil's polyunsaturated, and then you have monounsaturated, which basically means that there's only one hydrogen buoy on the polymer, one little hydrogen buoy on the polymer on its own, and that tends to be more vegetable fats or vegetable oils. They're less viscous than something like olive oil, more translucent, and they have less hydrogen buoys for the ride. And then where we get trans fats is basically when we oxidate fat. So if you cook with a polyunsaturated or cook with a monounsaturated fat at a high heat, you end up with trans fat. And trans fats aren't termed as organic, and they've been linked to like lots of health problems. So when you deep fry shit in vegetable oil, that's a lot of trans fat action. So if you're cooking with oils, generally speaking, you want to use a saturated oil, so lard, coconut oil, sunflower oil. You want to cook, generally speaking, with saturated fats to avoid creating trans fats in your diet, because they have been linked to bad health and stuff. Maybe a little bit of spurious because they're generally linked to fast food, which there's a hell of a lot more going on there than just trans fats, but maybe something to think about. So these are sources of fat in your diet. We kind of already discussed that. So you've saturated, polyunsaturated, and monosaturated. And here you just have some examples of where you can get those in your diet. We'll leave it up for a little while so you can have a look. I'll just link the slides. Link the slides in the description, and then you can just download it then, check it out at your own leisure. So how much fat is enough? So generally speaking, it's generally recommended by most health bodies or most health organizations. You want 25 to 30% of your total daily dietary calorie intake to come from fats. And I mean, there are different recommendations. Some people will recommend higher monosaturated, higher polyunsaturated, and lower saturated, but I think just an equal split's best. Just 33% saturated, 33% polyunsaturated, 33% monosaturated. The gram content you'll work out from your calorie requirement. So if your calorie content is X, then you take 25 to 30% of that number, depending on how much fat you want to take. And then you divide that by 9, and that'll give you the total amount of grams in your diet you're shooting for. So let's take all that and put it into a working example of something you might want to do. So here we have our fictional lifter. Her name is Eve. She's 167 centimeters tall. She's 27 years old. She's currently 78 kilos in body weight. Her goal is she wants to get stronger and fill out the 84 kilo weight class and to be more competitive in that weight bracket. She trains 4 days per week. She has 2 heavy days and 2 lighter days. And what we're going to do is we're just going to come up with a very basic plan based off this scenario that Eve could use to start working towards her goal in a sensible manner. So first of all, we need to work out what Eve's calorie requirement are. So we've just taken the metric version of the female basic metabolic rate equation. So basic metabolic rate, as we discussed in the last lecture, is how much calories you need to stay the same weight at bed rest. So if you're to do fuck all, but lie in bed all day, it's the amount of calories you require to stay the same weight you are currently. So we punch our numbers in, we end up 1,569 kilocalories for maintenance. And then what we do is we use the Harris-Benedict formula, which is a jumped up name for an activity multiplier. So basically, you take one of these options, little to no exercise, from little to no exercise to super extra active. We're going to say she's moderately active. She trains 4 days per week. She might have a sedentary job. I didn't make that up in the description. She's just kind of a normal person who does lifts weights 4 days a week. So for that person who is fairly normal, that's moderate exercise. We're going to use a multiplier of 1.55 for that. So that's going to give us 2,430 kilocalories based off her BMR and her activity levels. That's our goal for maintenance. And we're going to manipulate that based off our other target. First, we'll work out our macronutrient split. So her protein, we're going to aim for 2 grams per kilogram per day. We could even maybe bring that down a little bit because we are in a calorie surplus. So we could maybe aim at 1.4, 1.6 grams if you wanted to, if you maybe wanted to have a higher fat or a higher carbohydrate intake. For someone who's a vegetarian or someone who is a vegan, that's a strategy you might want to utilize because it can be more difficult to get protein in your diet with those constraints. But we're going to say 2 grams per kilogram. That's going to give her 156 grams per day target. Her fat intake, we're just going to take 30% of her maintenance, which is going to be 81 grams per day. 240 kilograms times 0.3 and then divide by 9. We divide by 9 because that's the calorie content per gram. Carbohydrate intake, we're going to take our target calories and then we're going to minus that. We're going to minus the protein and fat calories from that. And then we divide by 4. So 240 goal. Her protein calories are 156 times 4. Her fat calories are 81 times 9. So we minus that from 430 and then we divide by 4 because there is 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, and that's going to give us the target of 260 grams per day. So her targets are going to be for maintenance, our baseline, 2,430 kilocalories, 156 grams of protein, 260 grams of carbs, 81 grams of fat. How you split that up into your daily meal plan, we might cover in another lecture, but it's fairly redundant. As long as you're hitting these targets, then that's sweet. We're happy. So we're going to go into how we manipulate that a little bit. We want to create a small calorie surplus. We're going to look to gain between 250 to 500 grams per week. As such, we're going to aim for a 1,500 calorie surplus over the week. And how I've worked that out is there's 3,500 calories per pound of fat. So we're going to look to gain half a pound. So a pound's for 454 grams. And half a pound's going to be 227. So we're anywhere from like half a pound to a pound or 250 to 500 grams we're happy enough with. If we're constantly on the upper end of that scale, we might want to readdress it. If we're constantly not gaining, we might want to readdress it. But that goes back to what we spoke about in the last talk about having processes and habits and having feedback loops to help and inform decisions. This is just a basic plan. So what we're going to do, we're just going to add in 375 calories on every training day. And how we're going to do that is simple. We're just going to eat more carbohydrate. Carbohydrate's a very easy lever we can just add and take away from a diet. So if we have a set eating pattern where we're maybe 4 meals a day, and those meals are fairly static, or at least the themes of the meals are fairly static, then we can add carbs or take away carbs to change the calorie content of the day, change the calorie content of the meal, change the calorie content of the week, and it's super easy. So as you can see, we have heavy days on Saturday and Monday. We have rest days Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Lighter days Saturday and Wednesday. You could even look to say, right, on the light day, I'm going to eat a maintenance, and I'm going to take that 375 calories and I'm going to spread it over Saturday and Monday if you wanted to. You could even eat at deficits on your rest days if you want. A mild deficit's not going to hurt, as long as the net of the week is what we want. So if we're wanting to gain weight, if we want to gain weight, as long as the net of the week is surplus and we want to gain, we're good. If we want to lose weight, and if we want to lose weight and the net of our week is negative, then that's fine. You can manipulate your calorie content on a daily basis. So, for example, if like the flip of this, if I wanted to lose weight or I'm trying to get leaner, but I've got 4 training days, I could eat a maintenance or eat a slight surplus on those days, as long as I take that into account on my rest days and bring the calories down. So the net over the week is going to be what I'm aiming to train towards. So this is just like a little bit of an example of how we can manipulate, how we can work out what the macronutrient content of the person's diet's going to be based off them and their goals, but also how we can use their training schedule or their training goals to help manipulate that. And then very briefly, we're going to talk over micronutrients. Micronutrients are super important for health. They are something you want to eat, generally speaking, unless you want to get scurvy and the likes, which I don't think you do. On the left-hand side, we have examples of various micronutrients, where you can get them, and the recommended intake. Kind of the main things you need to take away. There are 2 kinds of micronutrient. There are water soluble, such as vitamin C, where you can eat as much of that as you want. And if you eat too much of it, you'll just piss it out, and it's not a problem. It's not a good idea to eat too much, because you're just wasting it. However, there's no real deleterious effects. It's not a bad idea. Well, it's not going to end in sickness, I guess. And then there's fat soluble, such as vitamin D, where you can build up toxicity and end up with fairly severe health problems on some of this. So for fat soluble vitamins and minerals, you do not want to eat surplus constantly. It's not a good idea. This is where the varied diet is essential and very important. You need micronutrients in your diet to be healthy, to be energetic, to live a full life. Basically, you need micronutrients, and the vast majority of them, they're going to be found in different places. Why you need a varied diet. Fruit and veg are friend. We want to have them in our diet. We don't want to shy away. So 5 portions per day is probably low. You probably want to look to like 5, 10, 15 portions fruit and veg a day is not a bad idea. And if you don't like veg, well, if you don't like fruit, you don't like veg, maybe grow the fuck up and start eating it. If you want to supplement with, we will cover supplements in a talk separately. So I'm not big on supplements. I don't believe. I think it's a lot of bullshit and a lot of hype, but there are some merits to it. So we'll cover supplements as a topic probably in the next talk. But if you did want to supplement with a micronutrient, I think iron, for some people, vegetarians and vegans can struggle to get. So like the iron intake you'll get for something like that. So spinach has high iron. It's non-hem iron, which means that your body really struggles to use it. Whereas beef and red meat is a really good source of iron that your body can actually utilize. So if you are a vegetarian or you are a vegan, iron supplementation is something you should probably look at. ZMA, I think, is just quite a good zinc magnesium. I think it's a good one for sleep quality. It might be a bit of placebo, but I've had positive experiences with it in the past. There is some science to back it up. I think it's a worthwhile micronutrient to supplement with. Vitamin D, if you live in a northern climate such as Scotland, UK, North America, somewhere where you get long days in the summer and long nights in the winter, you 100% should be supplementing with vitamin D. If you aren't currently, that is something you should look at and start doing. Also in the current Rona scenario, it's been shown to have some positive effects. People who are unfortunate to be to catch it. So definitely at this current climate, you definitely want to look at supplement with vitamin D, but it's a good idea anyway. And then multivitamins can be a good insurance policy if your diet is shit. However, if you have a good diet, then they're kind of a waste of time. But, it doesn't really hurt as long as it's water-soluble multivitamins. Okay, that's going to cover this talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. Anything you want to see me cover in future, you can leave a comment below. I'm going to do more talks like this, so if there's anything specifically within the sports science nutrition realm you want to see talked at in this format, which is I think is probably a little bit more academic than most people will do on their YouTubes, probably a bit less kind of bro sciencey and a bit more just fucking sciencey, leave a comment and I'll do a deep dive. I'm not going to get into the weeds on any kind of sports science shit, so if you're looking for specifically sports science chat, probably not the guy. But if you want more of like a practical take with someone who has sports science training and experience of actually implementing that in various settings with different populations, then it's something I can talk to. So if there's anything you want covered specifically, you can leave a comment below or sling a DM. Thanks very much for watching. Like and subscribe, of course, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.